A number of summers ago, as a faculty member of a prestigious adult leadership program, I found myself on an early morning Starbucks line with a member of the program. We introduced ourselves, and hearing that her husband had joined her for the program, I innocently asked her where he was that morning and whether he'd be joining us for the morning prayers and for the classes. She said no, he was up already, but he wasn't going to be coming to anything because he had already made his way into town for an annual meeting that takes place for those individuals who happen to own sports teams. I innocently thought, oh, sports teams, maybe a local baseball team or a small football team. I don't know. Like, what do I know from sports teams? And so I innocently said, again, what team does your husband own? And she said, oh, the Minnesota Vikings. Without missing a beat, I said, wow, what happened with Adrian Peterson? The woman shrugged awkwardly, and I was silent. For those of you who don't know who Adrian Peterson is, or maybe don't know the reference here, even if you know him, he was and is an American football running back. He's a football player who is widely considered to be one of the greatest football players of all time. In 2014, Peterson, who was then playing for the Minnesota Vikings, he missed essentially the entire season that year when he was indicted on charges of reckless or negligent injury to a child. He had used a switch, a long, thin, flexible branch that is used in corporal punishment to discipline one of his children, who was at the time just 4 years old. The boy suffered cuts and bruises to his legs, on his buttocks, and even on his scrotum. Huge welts. A Minnesota doctor saw the marks and reported them on behalf of this 4-year-old. This gesture, reporting to the authorities, the willingness to speak out on behalf of this little boy, was of course a moral obligation, but it's not an obvious moral choice. It wasn't for that doctor, and unfortunately for most of us. In a nationwide survey that was conducted exactly 1 year ago by the New York Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, the nation's oldest child protection agency, that survey found that large percentages of Americans report that they were unlikely to confront a parent or tell child protection officials if they see a parent excessively spanking or physically punishing a child. Unlikely to confront, unlikely to report. The survey found that only 21% of American adults say that they would have a direct conversation with a parent they know about his or her behavior if they learned that the parent was excessively spanking or physically punishing his or her child. 37% say they'd be unlikely to do it, right? Not likely to, but unlikely to do so. Only 19% of adults say that they'd be very likely to report the parent who is excessively spanking or physically hurting a child to protective services. In fact, 34% say that they would absolutely not do it. Only 36% of adults say in this study that they would call 911 or report to the police if they saw a stranger excessively spanking or physically punishing a child. The survey also reported on the reasons Americans gave for being reluctant to speak up, to break a silence. 6 out of 10 said because they were concerned for the welfare of the child, it might make it worse for them. A full 30% say that the reason is they don't believe it's any of their business. It isn't easy to speak up for those who don't have a voice. It isn't easy to speak up for those who don't have a voice, even if it is our own children. In tomorrow morning's Torah reading, Parshat Shmini, we will find in chapter 10 of the book of Leviticus the story of the two children of Aaron who, entering into the Holy of Holies, were taken. A fire emerged from heaven, Vateitzei ish, may Shamayim, that a heavenly fire descends and takes Nadav and Avihu, the two eldest sons of Aaron. And in verse 3, the Torah will tell us, in the immediate aftermath of that traumatic loss of Aaron's two eldest sons, Vayomer Moshe el Aharon, hu asher dibeh Adonai lemor. Moses said to his older brother Aaron, this is what God meant when God said, through those near to me, B'krovai ekadesh, v'al pnei kol ha'am ekaved. God says in Moses' words that those near to me I will show myself holy and gain glory before all of the people. And then Aaron, Vayidom Aharon. And Aaron was silent. Aaron's silence has been understood by many commentators to be a noble silence. In the face of unspeakable loss and grief, Aaron's silence is a powerful testimonial to the inadequacy of language to make sense of the senseless. Aaron's noble silence is often contrasted with Moses' loquaciousness and anxiety in navigating this tragic event. Moshe can't stop talking. The one who has no words can't stop throwing them out to his brother. But yet, Aaron's silence can also be read in contrast to the moral voice of Abraham in the story of Sodom and Amorah, where Abraham has the audacity to argue with God, henceforth setting a Jewish precedent for speaking truth to power. Aaron doesn't shout or speak out against this horrific injustice. Vayidom Aharon, Aaron doesn't say a thing. Aaron, the one who is the mouthpiece for his younger brother Moshe, can't find his words even to protest on behalf of his own children. Vayidom Aharon, Aaron's silence in the text is deafening. Could it be that he, like so many of us, was afraid to argue or name what he had actually seen? Afraid that God might harm his two remaining boys? Perhaps his silence, like ours, in the face of corporal punishment, is acquiescence, is some admittance of complicity and guilt. Perhaps Aaron believes that it isn't wrong because, after all, we learn from these experiences, don't we? Perhaps Vayidom Aharon, Aaron is silent because one isn't really allowed to question a received tradition or to be disobedient. Maybe, lastly, Aaron is silent because somewhere in his own heart-mind, he believed that there are cultural differences in the way people relate to the divine that allows God off the hook, as it were, for such an egregious and abusive activity. What's remarkable is, as we turn to Shabbat of the Child this weekend, is that we know for a fact that the highest rate of victimization in this country for children is of children who are in their first year of life. We know that the victimization rate for girls of child abuse is 9.4 per 1,000, and that for boys, 8 per 1,000. We know that sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, and neglect is pervasive. That even within this very Zoom room, in a room populated by so many of you on the coastlines and those of us who have been exposed to all kinds of progressive parenting styles and approaches, even in this room, around the Zoom, 1 in 3 women and 1 in 5 men will have had a violation of some kind, a sexual violation, a sexual abuse experience, and our children too. Vayidom. And we've been silent. Silent in the sense that as a community, the Jewish community pays almost no attention to these numbers in grand scale. Vayidom, we are silent in the face of these realities because on some level, we don't know how to talk about it. We don't know how to name it. We don't know how to enter it. It scares us. Vayidom. And we fall into silence. Not only is this prevalence of silence a phenomena that we find around excesses, right? The excess of spanking. That term is over and over. It's used when polled excessive spanking, excessive corporal punishment. I shudder to think when I remember reading that story from Adrian Peterson and his son. I shudder to think, what if the child had not had bruises? What if the child had not had huge welts on his leg? Things that had not been noticed, if he had not crossed the line, as it were, into the legal element of child abuse, where the law defends children. What if it had just been a normal everyday spanking, a normal everyday corporal punishment? What then, Vayidom? In fact, in the wake of Peterson's, in the event that took place with Adrian Peterson, in the wake of that, there was a study done, an ABC News poll on corporal punishment. It showed that 65% of Americans approve of spanking children in the home. 65%. Peterson himself went on to say, he admitted that 4 years after he had been indicted, he admitted that when other methods like taking away the electronics of the children, putting them into a timeout, or having them do wall squats, when those don't work, he still uses a belt to punish his children. And at times, he uses a switch, which he once said he would stop using. He understood that what he did to his young son was a mistake, but he doesn't believe that what he now does is called child abuse. It wasn't my intention, he said, to do that, referencing the cuts and the bruises that he caused, but it happened. What is at the core of this confusion, not only about why we're silent about the egregious elements of child abuse, but even about the simple clarity, the moral and ethical clarity that even to raise a hand to a child is criminal? What could possibly be the source of this moral and ethical confusion and ambiguity amongst us? Or the certainty of the 65% of Americans who think that still spanking and potching is okay? One shudders when one reads in the codes of the conservative movement, no greater a person, right? No greater person than the great Rabbi Elliot Dorff, one of the great halachic decisors of our generation, a man of impeccable ethics and morality, who writes in a responsum of the conservative, progressive, liberal Jewish movement, conservative Judaism, writes these words. He writes that although it's true that we no longer believe that it is okay to beat children, one must distinguish, he says, between discipline of a child and child abuse. It is arguable whether striking a child is ever a good way to discipline that child. But if it is, that would constitute one end of a spectrum, and child abuse would be on the other. He then goes on to write, right? This is unbelievable when I read this. We moderns, though, no longer think of children as parents' property to do with as we will, but rather as the parents' blessing and the parents' responsibility to raise into moral, informed, caring, and productive adults. We recognize that hitting a child is usually not the best way to accomplish those ends. But consequently, while we conservative rabbis would acquiesce to a light smack on the buttocks, or even striking the child elsewhere on the body with an open hand, but not punching or pummeling with a fist, only those types of contact that do not produce bleeding or a bruise would be permissible. Just to feel into the craziness of that moral calculus, that a child has fewer rights under the law than animals who are beaten, or adults against whom the raising of a hand, even a slight potch or a smack on any other part of the body, would constitute assault. The most vulnerable, the most impacted, the most formative part of the human race in this country, at this moment in history, are not protected under the law from those they love the most. This law also applies to schools around this country where corporal punishment is still legal. In fact, there are still many who argue to make paddling legal in various states where you take a paddle to a child to discipline them. Of course, at the heart of this ignorance, this blindness, and our own silence is that all of us, on some level, were born into what Alice Miller called the poisonous pedagogy of for your own good. The notion that to teach our children who are never to be rationalized with, is to treat them as other than fully human. Even in our terminology around psychology, right? There's psychology for adults and developmental psychology for children. We live in an adult-centered universe with ageism and adult-centrism where the children we live with and the children within us have been treated first as chattel, but no longer as chattel, but now less than human. We say things like, oh, they'll forget it. What happens to them when they're young will be forgotten. This is part of the poisonous pedagogy and the willful ignorance, as it were, that we bring into this space. Bahidom. We must cry out. We must break this silence of this deafening silence, this contract of silence. We must cry out for the sake of the children and say, what happens to the children will be remembered. What happens to our youth, they will carry with them into the next generation. There is no greater social agenda than the agenda of raising children with love and with safety and with shelter. There is no greater moral obligation. And to those of us who feel at times as though we can't speak up in the face of someone who says, oh, my husband owns the team that kept that individual on their payroll. When we sit in the silence of, we see what's happening, and we can only imagine if it's happening in public to that child, can you really imagine how horrible it must be for them in silence, when the door is closed, when no one is looking? And so we as Americans, we as human beings must begin to say no. Never again. Never again. Because we as a people, this week, we spoke to the powerful aspect of memory. To remember as a Jew is to say that mattered. To remember the children, to say that those children's lives matter. That I will stand with you. I will march with you. That we won't just let one synagogue in this country have one Shabbat of the child, but that every synagogue in every city around this country will one day say together, we say no to corporal punishment, to raising a hand to a child. That if we say that we wouldn't want that as part of our domestic relationship between spouses, if you can do it to your wife, your husband, your spouse, if you can't do it to them, you can't do it to your child. If you can't raise your hand to your spouse, you can't raise your hand to your child. And I know that it's not easy and it's very complicated, but no cultural differences and no cultural beliefs can deny the reality of what we know to be evidentiarily true. Children's brains, children's hearts and minds are affected by violence, and they do remember. They remember their whole lives through. I remember when I was, and I shared this with this community, and I shared it publicly in a number of places, that as a survivor myself, I came late to the memories that I had experienced as a young man, some as early as 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years old. I remember watching the great late John Bradshaw, whose work so formed me and so inspired me and healed me. Watched him on PBS in a special called Homecoming. And John played this song that haunted me for years and that buoyed me. I went back to find it. And it went something like this. ABC me crying, Mama make me smile. Hold me in your arms a little while. And the powerful refrain of the song was, try to remember the child that once was you. But remember, the child will remember. But remember, the child will remember his whole lifetime through. The child will remember. I pray that we find the strength to enact into law into this country and in every country a law that makes it illegal to raise a hand against a child. I pray that we, this community and communities like ours, do the training and the hard work that will allow us and give us the strength to be able to identify child abuse, to make a safe space for children to feel safe enough to tell us their experience and to be heard. I pray that we act for the sake of the children. It is upon us.